Welcome to UGC program E-Patashala. The course is on Japanese history and society. Module number 27, the paper is titled Japan and World War I. To give you an overview of the whole course, there was a great transformation of Japan from feudalism to modern with all-round development in the country. However, participation in the World War I was a bittersweet victory as far as Japan is concerned. Japan's role in the European theater of war, Japan's role in the Pacific area, and war and decision making in Japan, and road to defiance and Second World War, post-World War I are the contents in this course. The great transformation in Japan, to quickly take a look at it. These have been to quite an extent in different papers covered. However, to repeat it in order to help you understand better and relate it to the present paper also. There was a shift, great shift actually, from isolation of the Tokugawa period, say 1602 to 1852. And this transformation from feudalism to modern period was one of the landmarks of the modern history of Japan. And post Tokugawa period, that was actually the Meiji period that spanned from 1868 to 1912, is actually a period of engagement of Japan with other countries, both within Asia and outside of it. And Japan's path to modernization and industrialization is another notable achievement that Japan had achieved. And it was also admired as an Asian power. It was simply a feudal country before, now it has become an Asian power. Japan's identity defined under Pan-Asian ideology, liberator of other Asian countries, Japan were called, from colonized by other Western countries. In 1894 and 95, Japan had a war with China, and it was concluded by the Treaty of Shimonoseki. In 1902, Japan concluded an alliance with England, Great Britain. That's called Anglo-Japanese Alliance of 1902. This was renewed in the year 1910. And before that, in 1904 and 5, there was another war with Russia. Japan won this war too. And by defeating such a great power as Russia and before that China, Japan actually expanded its military and its navy throughout Asia and Asia Pacific in good part. Japan developed slightly a racial and a superiority sentiment and complex against other Asian countries. Having developed first, having modernized first, they were always treating themselves as most superior people. Bittersweet victory in the sense that Europe was the main place or area or theater where World War I actually was quite active and quite visible, quite observable, and it had major impact there. It was profound impact on international relations of the Asia Pacific region in particular, because we consider Japan here and Japan's role in World War I. Asia Pacific, say when we European colonial powers and unjust treatment of Asian powers. There were a lot of treaties which were most favorable to European colonizers than to the Asians. As European colonial influence was to some extent limited, its power vacuum created in the Asia Pacific. And since most of the European powers were active in Europe itself during the wartime, that gave an opportunity for Japan to expand its own political, colonial, economic interests in the Asia Pacific region. The rise of Japan up to say 1912, that was under the Meiji period, as a most modern advanced military nation, this had actually gradually led to the decline of West in the Asia Pacific, especially after World War I. Japan's rise as an imperial power is the very noticeable achievement of Japan post World War I. Out of circumstances and not very deliberate assumption has been titled for Japanese advance post World War I. Anyway, whether it was an opportunity or it was the right circumstances can, however, be better known when we consider many other factors that are related to Japan's role in World War I. In 1902, Anglo-Japanese alliance was concluded, as mentioned before, and this was against Russian expansion in the Far East. Victory for Japanese diplomacy to be recognized by the West after victory over Russia. 1905, Japan defeat of Russia, actually Britain heaved a sigh of relief. In 1907, Britain and Russia, actually it was an entente. As Britain declared war on Austria and Hungary, the Japanese were scared of their own involvement because of the alliance. Immediately, Japan declared war on Germany in the August of 1914. Japan must take chance of millennium to establish its rights and interests in Asia, some of the slogans that came about. However, it was Japan as a part of Allied coalition against Germany and wanted to replace European control in Asia and also gain European recognition of its status and potential. However, it was also wanting to be a part of the international deliberations on distribution of wealth and values. However, whether or not Japan was able gradually to achieve its ambitions will be known as we proceed to take stock of other events. Japan sent Germany an ultimatum demanding German disarmament or withdrawal of German vessels from East Asian water. This was quite a demand from the Japanese side because Germany was more involved in Europe itself because of war and because of its interest. Gradually, it could not attempt to protect all its interests and colonies in the Pacific, Western Pacific. So, actually Japan seized German colonies in the Pacific. It was quite an amphibious assault. Japan secured Tsingtao, also the Shantung Peninsula in China, German and South Pacific islands of Micronesia, Marshalls, Carolines, Mariana, these all came under the Japanese control. And Japan's role in European theater, if we continue to take little stock, in the year 1916 and 1917, Japan's strategic interests were dominating Japanese thoughts. How to expand. Expanding north into continental Asia was also one of the major ambitions. Outset of Russian Revolution, as Russia backed out of World War I, is to be considered. Along with allies, Japan sent troops to Siberia. That was the last, actually Japan was one of the last countries to leave for Siberia. Ishii-Lansing agreement on recognition of Japanese territory in the Pacific was also concluded, and short-lived Japanese ambition because US rolled back territorial acquisition. Japan never fired at German East Squadron. However, it lost only 2,000 casualties in comparison to other powers who were involved in the Asia Pacific. However, Japan's Pan-Asian ideology is to espousing social Darwinism. Asia for Asians was another important slogan that Japanese gave during that period, so that Asians can rule themselves and Asia must be ruled by Asians, and Europeans should have no business in Asian countries. However, these were some of the leadership quality by issuing slogans Japanese displayed during war. Asia for Asians was one of the most powerful slogans even today that one recalls when considers Japan's role in World War I. It was, however, onward path of imperialism and aggression if we really see Japanese activities in Asia of total expansion of the territories and economic interests. Territories occupied by Japan during World War I were actually Karafuta, that's below 5th parallel, then Sakhalin, then Shantung Peninsula, Port Arthur, and Darien. Post the World War I, Britain, New Zealand, Australia, US were against this and wary of the Japanese because they expanded more than anybody in the Asian territory. Japan has later forced China to sign 21 demands, rigorous in wanting to own Shantung, avail trading of Liaotong, not just cede territory to other powers. China to observe Japanese administration in the civil administrative framework. America only opposed this and upheld the open door policy and sided with China. The Okuma cabinet came to power in 1915, and it was during this time when Army and Navy were bickering over budgets and strategies, because Army, that's basically the military, and it was Navy which was virtually going around Asia and occupying territories after territory, and certain victories which are simply basically credited to Japanese Navy, that gave rationality to Japanese Navy to demand more budgetary provisions for Navy. Actually, double the budgetary provisions for military were granted to the Navy, and Japanese Navy was and their power and their expansion and even their prestige was recognized internationally. Far from actually, for Japanese during World War I, the path of imperialism is clearly set, not out of paranoia, not power hungry, but to prove internal strength, to revise unequal treaties. Internal strength linked to conquest and expansion. Japanese policies and motives for imperialist expansion were different during Meiji period and subsequently during Taisho period, that is 1912 to 1926. The period in Japanese history from 1912 to 1926 is called Taisho period. During this period was it that World War I occurred, and during this period we had some problem relating to political crisis. Say for example, in Japanese decision making process there were some differences between Genro and also, for example, the new politicians who are getting elected to the lower house of the parliament. Differences in the political personalities and between the houses Genro was really clearly coming out. And Japanese grand strategic designs were influenced by struggle for power between these two camps. Genro faction, that is the elder statesmen, influential politicians in the upper house, they favored in fact military and territorial gains, but parliamentarians, elected parliamentarians, particularly in the lower house, they were for economic gains and they were more for liberal China policy. Given these differences between the elected parliamentarians and the Genro in making decisions, there was certain delay and there were certain ambitions, and actually one did not know both the military and the politicians and the Navy going in different way in making a decision. The debate relating to whether Japan actually was quite prominent. The differences between military strategy and between Army and the Navy were coming out openly. Army favored continental expansion while conservatives supported it. Navy favored moderate maritime policy towards preserving commercial interests. Japan's wait and watch approach in World War I, actually they were not too quick to cash in on. They were trying to assess the international conditions and behavior. No implementation of militaristic Asia Monroe Doctrine yet. Only during World War II Japan looked at defense parameter. Ultimately, Japan's China policy was the biggest flaw. 21 demands to China was detrimental. Japanese territorial exclusivity in Shantung province, Manchuria, Inner Mongolia, Port Arthur and Port Darien were some visible and observable features. US, Britain were actually in a way opposed to some of the Japanese mindless expansion. Japan's rise to imperial power is to be recognized. Expectations of the benefits of war because of siding with allies and playing neutral role during World War I was really major gain for the Japanese. But international changes were occurring around that time, shift from colonial to imperial system to Washington system, Japan espousing outdated values as opposed to actually Wilsonian ideals of self-determination and independence. Japan did not adopt Washington system. Post World War I, being on the victor side, gaining territory and gaining market access and gaining control on European interests in Asia, Japan really enjoyed a rise in its national identity, status and global recognition. There was some trouble, but there were some real achievements. Japan, which was a debtor nation till about World War I, suddenly turned in the post-immediate war period as a creditor nation. I think this is one of the major achievements of Japan by participating in World War I. Number two, this is not a long continuing creditor status of Japan as a nation, because very soon there were some trouble elsewhere and the exports declined and exploring new markets were difficult and inflation occurred. And during this time, inflation occurred, meaning people were unable to pay for rising prices of essential commodities for their day-to-day managing their lives. So inflation led to some crisis, social crisis. Rice riots occurred in Japan. In order to deal with these disturbances, Japan enacted gradually peace preservation law to control the public rights. Post World War I, Japan's recognition actually came from the West when it was admitted to Paris Peace Conference, Washington Conference, and moreover also was given a permanent position in League of Nations. And subsequently, the Great Depression, and in the 1920s, however, we find politically some movement towards democratization. But gradually in the 30s, post Great Depression of 1929-30, in the 1930s, military gained prominence and power and influence over the politicians. And when military gained decision-making power and influence, it was almost like Japanese militarism, mindless expansion in Asia and towards the road to World War II. Actually, Japan, Italy, Germany were dissatisfied with the imposition of order by Anglo-American alliance. The path to defiance of defined when Japan withdrew from League of Nations in the year 1933, and post 1931 up to 1945, it was just warlike environment. Japan itself toward a road towards war, and it was just war, and we just cannot say Japan was not responsible for World War II. No, Japan was positively responsible for World War II. After going through the contents of this paper, after scanning the slides, after listening to the explanation on the basis of slide, you can now really ponder over some of the questions relating to this course in particular. How did Japan transform into an imperial power? This is a very interesting story. This actually totally explains Japan's shift from feudalism to a modern nation and building up of military, a strong military, testing its military strength in war against China in 1894-95, war against Russia in 1904 and 5, and Anglo-Japanese treaty, of 1902 renewed in 1910, 1910 occupation of Korea, from 1914 to 18 participating on behalf of and along with allies in World War I, subsequent rise as an international power. This is Japan's imperial power rise, which probably is very fascinating for students of your level. Next question could be, how did Japan justify its expansion into Asia? One, military expansion in order to obtain commercial entry into large parts of Asia, and even procurement of resources through extraction of resources from Asian countries to feed to the expanding or ever expanding Japanese industrial requirement at home. Next question could be, what was Japan's role in the European area during World War I, and what motivated Japan to expand southwards? How was Japan perceived by end of the World War I? Clearly as the international power. So, Japan's rise from feudalism to imperialism to modern power to military modernization, and then being all things to gain from World War I, was nothing like a rise as an international power. Thank you very much.